afternoon, everyone, and welcome back for part 2 of our SCHADS Award webinar series in collaboration with CheckUP. We're so glad to have you with us again as we continue to explore the complexities of this award and how to manage them confidently. Last month, we covered the foundational elements of the SCHADS Award and the importance of proactive compliance. Today, we're diving deeper into the more advanced and often misunderstood aspects of the award, especially those that create operational headaches if not managed properly. As always, our aim is to cut through the complexity and give you practical guidance that supports compliance, reduces risk, and makes managing your workforce that little bit easier. Now, please note that today's webinar is being recorded and we will be sharing the recording with you after the session, so you'll be able to revisit the content or share it with your team. Now, before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we all meet today. I pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us in the webinar and to elders past, present and emerging for their ongoing contributions to our communities. For those of you joining us for the first time, welcome. So I'm Emma, a HR consultant at Effective HR, and I'm joined today by my brilliant colleague, Corinne, our lead HR consultant. Together, we've spent many years supporting businesses across the NDIS and community services sector with a focus on HR, workplace health and safety, payroll compliance, and interpreting and applying the SCHADS Award in real-world settings. In today's session, we'll focus on the key areas where SCHADS Award breaches most often occur. We'll begin by exploring award coverage, looking at the differences between SCHADS Award and the Health Professionals Award, and how to avoid those common traps of misclassification. We'll take a closer look at pay structures, including how salaries, flat rates, and individual flexibility agreements can be used, along with the risk of stepping outside of the standard hourly rates. From there, we'll move into employee benefits and allowances, covering entitlements such as leave, clothing and equipment, first aid, travel, and how to properly manage broken shifts. The second half of the session will tackle rostering complexities. As always, we'll finish with an interactive Q&A, so feel free to submit your questions via the chat at any time throughout the session, or alternatively use the QR code to book in a complimentary consultation with a HR consultant. I'll hand it over to Corinne now, who will take us through the technical content today.
Thank you so much, Emma, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Now, as Emma mentioned, this is part 2 of our SCHADS webinar series. So in our SCHADS Basics webinar, that is where we're speaking to understanding a lot of the key standard provisions that you see operating in a day-to-day basis to ensure compliance. Today, though, it's called Advanced for a reason. We're going to get pretty deep. We're going to get pretty nuanced. The stuff is tricky. I'm not in a position to hate the legislation, though, because it keeps me in a job, right? So together, we're going to wade our way through this and look at some very nuanced areas that the SCHADS Award applies in so that you're comfortable with that moving forward. As Emma mentioned, any questions that pop up, pop them in the Q&A. We will have a really robust Q&A session at the end, which is my favourite part. So just by way of recap, what we have looked at previously together is looking at the streams that are contained within the SCHADS Award. So we know that the SCHADS Award is that umbrella term for 4 different sectors, or as we like to say synonymously, streams. Those applying to our NDIS providers in this space are predominantly our home care and our social and community services, or SACS stream. You're able to listen to the recording of who fits into what stream on our website, but let's actually just do a bit of a recap now as well. When we're looking at how those streams apply to our business, our key takeouts here, we're applying the stream to our business as a whole. So we're doing that first. What is our service structure? What do we provide for our clients? How is our organization structured to work out as an industry? Where do we best sit, SACS or home care? It's only then that we would look to our classification schedules at the back of the award to then look at an individual classification level. That would be then applying to an employee. We'd also need to do those final pieces of the puzzle of pay points and shift worker, day worker determinations to correctly work out someone's rate of pay. What I've got there on the screen, a little example here, Jamie working with an elderly client in their home, providing companionship, assisting with personal care 3 days a week. On the 4th day, maybe does a social outing for multiple clients. Maybe this scenario is familiar to you. I regularly get asked, well, where does Jamie sit? You know, he's doing home care 3 days a week, but then on that 4th day, he's going out in the community. Do we switch streams? The short answer to that question is no, we don't. Because again, when we're looking at stream determinations, we're looking at it as an organisation as a whole, not any particular shift, not any particular employee, not any particular service. So we really want to be confident there. Another common issue we have pop up in more of this evolving space as your organisation grows is looking at when to apply the SCHADS Award as a whole to an organisation, and when maybe the Health Professionals and Support Services Award may creep in. What you may be familiar with is essentially the modern award system within Australia having 122 different awards that might apply to different industries and occupations. So there can often be a bit of an overlap and potentially a bit of grey area as to what applies when. If we look at a particular scenario that might be quite common in this industry around a qualified social worker, for argument's sake, when we look at the award structure, there is coverage for both a qualified social worker under our SCHADS Award and also under our Health Professionals and Support Services Award. So if we look at our particular scenario here on the screen, looking at Lisa as a qualified social worker, she's working in a disability support organisation and she's providing that social work duties and services, and will also assist in developing programs, running them, and case management. Where does Lisa fit and what does that look like? Again, thinking about our discipline of award coverage, we want to go back to what does the business do? This is something that we've actually liaised personally with the Fair Work Ombudsman on to understand a position and a determination here. So for this here, and what's been confirmed by the regulator, is that when we look at Lisa's scenario, she's providing these social work services within a disability support organisation. So that industry is still SCHADS. However, if you were providing that social work in more of a medical practice or allied health practice clinic style of setting, then this advice could very well change. So again, looking at the crux of what is our organisation doing. What we see under the SCHADS Award and how we might classify a social worker under the SCHADS Award, we have varying levels of classification depending on their certificate. So are they operating with a diploma or a degree? This is really relevant when determining wage compliance for this particular role. And that's some advice that you can apply as well across those different sorts of roles that might step in here as well. Just to be clear, we can't have someone covered by both awards. We do need to pick one award and that will apply in totality to employment. And we see this pop up again in the administration space. So if you think about your organisation and the clerical workers you might have in accounts, in rostering, in reception, we quite often get asked when people may be covered by the SCHADS Award or when they might be covered by the Clerks Award, which is that occupational award for those administration-based duties. How do we work out which one applies? I'm hoping by now you can answer that question in your head. It's going to depend on the nature of your organisation. What's really interesting here is that this determination is an evolving space. Previously, and for those of you that like to nerd out with the Fair Work Ombudsman like I do, we used to see on their library an article posted that had pretty clear advice to say, if you're using the home care stream of the SCHADS Award, you cannot put admin people there, they must be under class. Whereas if you're using the SAC stream of the award, you can put admin under there. Now, I always had some opinions about whether I believe that's right or wrong, for any of you that might have heard that. But What's interesting now is this article has disappeared from the website and the position is currently under review. So even though that's previously come out by the regulator, it's potentially subject to change. So when you're looking at your organisation of those people who aren't necessarily delivering those frontline supports that are acting in that administrative or back-end capacity, let's think long and hard about where they are covered and have confidence with that. Because the so what factor here of getting it wrong is pretty phenomenal. What that looks like, essentially, if we've got the wrong classifications, we're paying someone wrong. And it's a bit of a flow-on effect from there. So when I think about something like the CHADS Award, it doesn't have coverage for remote work, for on-call work, for sleepovers, for anything like that that might be coming up outside of those normal hours. The same thing applies with the Nurses Award. So it's kind of like, we need to make sure that it's not only the right minimum rate of pay, but also how we're triggering the way penalties are paid, overtime's paid, allowances. They are all different on an award per award basis. So if we're getting it wrong, there is an example where we may be accidentally underpaying or accidentally overpaying. Or what I see quite often, the worst case scenario of underpaying wages and overpaying superannuation. That's a very tricky one our systems and audit lead Renee deals with when it comes to looking at remediating pay issues there as well. So we need to make sure that we have our classifications correct. If we have someone that's potentially doing a blended role, so maybe they are doing support work 2 or 3 days a week and helping out as a team leader maybe, or in the office 1 or 2 days a week, what are we doing for them? What are they under? What classification do we pay? Those questions we get all the time. We are going to want to look at them on a case-by-case basis, and I am going to have 20 questions to ask about it, but we will be able to get to the bottom of it. Sometimes we often look at dual employment status as an option, and we've got some good 2020 case law there around an Australia Post case, actually, and a decision that can provide guidance as to how that works. So it's our job to interpret those case law, common law precedents, applying that to the award and to your organisation to make sure that we've got the right fit there of how we're structuring employment. Now, you would have heard me speak recently about pay point progressions, what we need to be aware of there. So by way of recap, make sure we're looking at clause 13.3 of the award. Again, another interesting case law precedent that we've had recently is around how to interpret this clause. The key word here that we're looking at is around eligibility and not entitlement. So this actually gives us a good bit of commercial wiggle room to not automatically progress people year on year, which is good because we'll end up pricing ourselves out of business. It's not viable to keep doing that. So how can we create this commercial system in line with these pay point progressions to make it work? Really simple process for me. I like to have an anniversary checklist, say, is someone going up, are they not, and why? And the key here that I'm sure you'll all agree with me on is communication, so that there's no nasty surprises to employees, because they are going to have some weird and wonderful expectations of you that may not always be rational or realistic. So the fact that we're clearly communicating to say, we've reviewed this and you're not going up, and this is why, and this is the legislation, and this is the case law that backs it, is going to be a really easy way to get on the front foot before answering those questions at payroll time and potentially having the gossip in the workplace or the cultural implications that come from that as well. While we're talking about payroll, let's jump into exactly what that looks like when it comes to wages and salaries. What is the difference between a salary and a flat rate? Quite frankly, absolutely nothing. I find these words quite synonymous, but I guess if we were to nuance these words, a salary is probably what we're looking at as a yearly figure, so a per annum figure. A flat rate is usually broken down as an hourly figure. They're both designed to encompass an employee's total pay, So you might be wanting to incorporate some or all legislative entitlements into that rate. Maybe things like annual leave loading, maybe things like travel allowances, overtime, night shift penalties, etc. So you can put a salary into place. So you can pay those key members of yours a salary. We just need to make sure that we are ticking our compliance boxes. So what those compliance boxes look like from my end, firstly, correct employment contract that explicitly spells out what you are incorporating into the salary and how that is offset. That is going to be required if you want to rely on it. If there's no contract in place, there may as well not be a salary in place. So making sure that offset clause is going to align with what we see in our case law precedents to be watertight to offset if we're looking at any payroll issues there. We also need to complete what we call a boot calculation. Now, boot is an acronym for better off overall chest. So there's no good telling someone you're paying them 20 cents an hour above the award. You've rounded up to the nearest dollar. But for that, I want you to do 2 hours of overtime every week unpaid. It's not going to cut the mustard, right? It's not going to be good enough. What we find, and even if that contract is signed and agreed to, when we think about our employment relations framework in Australia, it's historically built on a master-servant relationship. Our legislation accounts for that and essentially says it doesn't matter what you put in a contract. If it's not compliant with the legislation, it's not going to pass. Okay, so we need to be doing those calculations to show that your salary arrangement with all the pieces that you are encompassing are high enough to cover the minimum entitlements under the legislation. So again, it's a very simple process. It's one that we would complete annually or as someone's role changes to make sure that we haven't accidentally underpaid anyone there. So we want our offset clauses in our contracts. We want to be documenting that boot calculation and potentially looking at what we call an IFA, which we'll look at shortly as well. That would be if we want to vary the way any terms of the award may apply. Okay, I'm expecting some questions to have come through on that one as well. To recap here, I guess it's good to look at a bit of scenario here. On the right-hand side of my screen, you can see Alec is on $90,000 as a team leader. His contract is intended to offset penalties, overtime, and allowances. And he's working a regular roster of weekends, overtime, broken shifts. We want to know, is his salary compliant? To answer the question, I don't know. It's not until we dig through those nuts and bolts of looking exactly at your roster, starting time, your finishing time, breaking that down for that boot calculation. So what that in essence is what would Alex have gotten paid under the award for doing all of those weekends, overtime, etc. And what did he get paid for the salary? Now that boot test is going to tell us if the salary is high enough or too low to cover that. You can see how if someone was doing a 3-hour shift on a weekend versus 12 hours over 2 days of the weekend, that can very much differ how that salary absorbs those extra penalties and overtime here. So while $90,000 on the face of it looks like a good weekend for a team leader, actually, when we break it down, it may result in an accidental underpayment. So we need to make sure that we're covered there. In terms of what could go wrong, you know, in this particular scenario, what if Alex challenges his pay? We need to make sure that we've got these documents in place. We can't offset a salary if the contract doesn't exist that he signed off on. We can't rely on that if we haven't done our boot calculations. That's not going to get us anywhere if we end up in court. So we need to make sure that we've got that documented for compliance there. A big so what factor for me here is what could go wrong. Now, underpayment cases in court, and look, we are supporting some clients through some pretty tricky ones at the moment. The statute of limitations for a claim here is 6 years. So can I easily access Alex's roster to see what Saturday he worked 6 years ago and to see what he got paid 6 years ago. That's the kind of information we need to be readily accessible to defend ourselves, right? To clear our name that we didn't underpay someone. What's, I guess, slightly nuanced and different to that is our record keeping obligations under the Fair Work Act. Now, that's different. That is 7 years. Timesheets, rosters, pay slips, all of those things you need to be able to produce for a period of 7 years. So making sure that we've got our documentation and our systems in place to protect you is what you want to look at there. Even just having us run our eyes over it to make sure that you've got it all good and correct is also, I guess, a key strategy here to mitigate risk there. Oh, I've gone backwards. When I really want to get to IFAs, there's a lot of information on the screen there, as you can see. Our IFAs, first and foremost, it's another silly HR acronym we like to use, Individual Flexibility Agreement. Okay, so this is not instead of a contract, it's on top of a contract, and it's on an individual basis. Okay, so it doesn't apply like an enterprise agreement or registered agreement would. It is solely for an employer and an employee. What we need to know about an IFA is that it's governed under the award system. So specifically for our SCHADS employers, it's clause 7 of the award, which has been copy pasted on the screen there. Now, I actually love this clause. And the reason why I love it is because it's clear and it's prescriptive. It tells me if I want to do an IFA, what can I do it on? How do I do it? What needs to be in the document? Love it. Every single time I'm drafting an IFA for a client, I will have this clause up to check and treat it like a little checklist, right? To make sure we've covered all bases. Super helpful. I wish that existed for every clause to tell me how to do sleepovers, right? So, when we are using an IFA, it's going to be to very certain terms. It could be as simple as incorporating annual leave loading and wanting to offset that on a global basis, i.e. over an annual period as opposed to pay period to pay period. It could be that a uni student only wants to work 2 hours on one side of a sleepover and not 4. We're varying terms because that's going to be suitable for everybody. It could be that we're varying to minimize the break between shifts from say 8 hours to 6 hours, again, because someone has requested that for their earning capacity or their family and caring responsibilities. There's plenty of reasons why an IFA might come into place, and we can vary only certain terms that are prescribed for at clause 7.1. In terms of when you can give this to employees and a new employee, the clause specifically says that it is after commencement. Okay, this is a big one. CommBank recently got done with a $5 million back pay because they gave everybody an IFA at the same time as they gave a contract with their offer, and they hadn't started work yet. They were deemed unenforceable. And so there was a huge back pay relating to that. So can I give it to them at the end of the first shift? Sure, that's good enough for me. They have commenced. We just want to be clear here with our processes. In terms of can I give an IFA to all support workers, I would be very hesitant. And the reason is going to come back to that name, individual flexibility agreement. This is not designed to be a coverall to fix holes in your roster. You know, that is not the right strategy to take. This is about on an individual case by case basis. Is this going to be mutually beneficial for everyone? Great. Let's document it up. Okay. We can't guarantee that IFAs are bulletproof for compliance because the only way that can be done is through the regulator themselves. However, they go a long way to mitigate risk. We're showing a genuine intention, not under duress or coercion, to document exactly why we're not following the award, exactly what we want to vary. We're acknowledging it. We're showing specifically, clause 7.5, the employee is better off overall. So that's going to work for us as well. I would like to see IFAs reviewed every 3 to 6 months to make sure they are still suitable. There's also extensive notice required to be given for termination of an IFA. So let's be keeping that in mind and reviewing regularly to make sure it's beneficial for both parties into the future. Okay, we're going to jump in now to some more nuanced SCHADS terms that you might not see come up all the time to make sure we know how to apply them. So the award does actually cover specific requirements, obligations, and allowances relating to clothing and equipment. So this one I think is really interesting. It does actually allow for the employer to decide if you're going to provide uniforms or if we're going to be paying for an allowance instead. The default is that the employer is responsible for providing and washing uniforms. If we're not washing them, then what happens? The award is covering these situations as well. What I find in the industry is that uniforms are quite rare because we don't want a blaringly obvious symbol that support is being provided. We want it to look like companionship and access to the community in that way. And that's great too. But then there are specific requirements around if someone is wearing their personal clothing and it gets soiled. My gosh, I hope it's not the Versace dress. We want to be practical around, well, what's happening? What clothes are we wearing? What reimbursements are we providing if clothing is getting damaged or soiled, which can happen for a variety of reasons while you're providing supports there. So we want to look at this from the perspective twofold of one, checking the award, so specifically checking clause 20.2, put that on our to-do list to see what's going to apply to us on a specific business case, depending on what your requirements are. And then also making sure, not only we've got the allowances and entitlements covered as per the award, but making sure we've got a policy to stipulate the reasonable requirements here, that we're not reimbursing the Versace dress, making sure that people are dressing appropriately at work, potentially not wearing necklaces that could cause a choking hazard. We're not wearing flip-flops. So if we need to run unexpectedly, we are safe and can do so safely. Those sorts of things, making sure we're setting those boundaries are going to be very important there as well. In terms of our first aid allowance, I find this particularly interesting because the entitlement is varied depending on what stream of the award you use. So specifically here, I'm talking about clause 20.6. And the key crux I want you to take away here is just because you have a first aid certificate doesn't automatically mean you get the allowance, okay? So specifically, we have a set rate that is applied, and that's available in the award. Off the top of my head, I was looking at this yesterday. It's about $20.46 or so. Don't quote me on that because could be I still need to update my Rolodex in my brain for end of financial year and new rates. And that's also applied on a pro rata basis for our casual and part-time employees. So if we are a home care employee, the first aid allowance is payable where the employee is required in any given week to be responsible for the provision of first aid to other employees. Okay, so that's an important differentiation because if we're a home care support worker, we're quite often potentially providing personal care, wound management, those sorts of things that may blur the lines with first aid. So that in that instance, it's only if you are that nominated first aid officer for the organisation where you might be doing it in an office setting. Maybe can we put home care under an office? Let's talk. Or about applying for other people in that setting as well. If we are covered under SAPS, we have a twofold requirement to access the allowance. Okay, first is that the staff member is actually required to hold the certificate. So did we stipulate in our contracts and PDs and job advertisements that they have to have that certificate? We've got it on file. And they are required to perform first aid at their workplace. So we're not being specific here around who we're performing it on, okay? But am I required to perform it? So What I often see employers do, because every employer needs them to hold a certificate, that could be part of that NDIS screening card that you need to have, differs, varies state by state. So, it may be encapsulated to say, right, you have to have it, but we don't actually need you to perform first aid. Okay. Therefore, I'm not paying you the allowance. Where are we specifying that? Where are we making it very clear? Because if you're saying in our contracts, I need it, why aren't you paying me for it? I want to be clear in our PDs that we're not actually required to perform that, and you are not directed to perform that. Our policies as well, particularly around work health and safety, setting those expectations if we're not paying those policies, to make it very clear. Okay. Travel. Oh, this is another favorite of mine, Emma. This is like a FAQs, isn't it? So I find that a lot of providers are confident in terms of when they're billing travel, when they're claiming travel from that NDIS perspective, but how that filters through to what an employee is entitled to. Heaven forbid the NDIS pricing guidelines and SCHADS Awards speak to each other. That would be delightful. It's not what we're dealing with though. And unfortunately, what I see very commonly is an employee will be entitled to be paid for travel where you can't bill it. Okay. That's not a sustainable business model. Therefore, we need to be making sure we're rostering correctly to minimize when travel is payable, to mitigate our costs there. So I've got on screen here clause 20.6 of the SCHADS Award, and this is telling us where we are required to pay for travel. So it is saying that where we are authorised to use our motor vehicle in the course of our duties, we're getting reimbursed 99 cents per kilometre. I do know that is the new rate as well from 1 July. It did not go up. So that includes not just client transport, that participant transport. It's not just that. It's also if I'm going from client A to client B in a shift, I need to be reimbursed those kilometres as well. So we want to be conscious of when that is going to be payable. We also then have excursions where we might be traveling. So this could be STA, this could be a variety of ways that this pops up. Generally, the advice I like to give with excursions is that all travel costs need to be covered. So flights, Ubers, tickets if we're going into Disneyland or things like that, meals associated. And so it can be quite a costly exercise. And what's interesting from a rostering perspective with excursions, and we'll touch on that shortly as well, it does flip our ordinary hours on its head a little bit. So I guess the key point here is to make sure you know what you need to pay before we agree to an excursion. So it's costed out and you can see that it's going to be an operationally viable support to provide, right? We want to be across that. So key for me here is doing that excursion or roster costing for that particular scenario, and getting a travel agreement in place. So again, crystal clear expectations, and that's not biting us in the bum later on. What I also want to look at for travel is when we pay it on a broken shift. Okay. So when we take that particular scenario I applied before of someone visiting client A and client B, we are paying kilometres reimbursed. We are also within a shift paying travel time. Okay. So clocking on and transporting. This can differ with a broken shift, so we like to look at how the two intersect. The shift example I have on the screen at the moment is looking at someone completing a broken shift with the first portion being from 6 a.m. till 10 a.m. The second portion being from 6 p.m. till 9 p.m. So what we find here with travel is I'm not paying someone to arrive at the first shift, but then when they are traveling between clients within that shift, they are being paid. Once they complete that first portion at 10 o'clock, wherever they may end up, there's no travel time, there's no kilometres reimbursement up until we're back on shift and then within the shift what we're doing. Okay, so if we have a continuous shift as well, say someone's just rostered from 9 till 4 with a half-hour break and they're seeing 3 clients, we are paying travel time and kilometres there as well. In lieu of someone getting travel time and kilometres in this broken shift, we have a broken shift allowance. Okay, so we've got one allowance set for if it's going to be broken into 2 periods of work and a higher allowance if it's broken into 3 periods. I want to be clear that that allowance is only payable once in that broken shift. So even though there's 2 periods of work, you pay it once. I have seen a payroll system set up incorrectly to be overpaying that, and that's just a nightmare for you. So these are the sorts of things we want to be checking. What's really interesting in this shift structure as well is what we see that 6 till 9 payable as. What you may be aware of, for those fellow nerds here, clause 25.6F of the award, it actually talks about the span of hours for a broken shift to be up to 12 hours. And what happens after that? After that, everything is paid at double time. Now, I want you to pay particular attention to the term double time. The way this is worded here is as a penalty payment on ordinary time earnings or OTA, as opposed to overtime, OT. Okay. What I will often see people do in this scenario is go, oh, double time, great, go into my payroll system, find the line that says OT 2 times, great, pay them that. No, incorrect. The so what factor for me here, penalty payments such as a Saturday, a Sunday, a public holiday, a shift loading, this broken shift penalty, they accrue superannuation, they accrue leave entitlements for our permanent employees on them. Okay. Overtime does not attract superannuation. Superannuation is payable on ordinary hours. Okay. So if we go into the system and just select the pay code that says 2 times, and that's set up to say overtime, what we end up doing is underpaying superannuation on that, potentially not getting the right calculation to begin with as well. Because double time in this scenario is calculated as a formula of double time of the permanent rate plus the 25% loading, which is that $6 or $8 an hour on top. So we actually need to be referencing the pay guide to confirm that dollars and cents amount and make sure that is set up correctly in our system to ensure wage compliance there and award compliance. I often see people go, yep, I know overtime, it's time and a half for the first 2 hours, double time thereafter. Yes, potentially no. Clause 28 of the award specifically sets out when overtime applies. It does vary based on the stream as well. Spells out what's happening for full-time employees covered under home care versus we've got different rules for part-time and casual employees. We've got different loaded rates for casuals. So very important that we are confident with how that is set up and that we're checking the award to make sure we're applying the right rates there. I want to touch on the idea of leave entitlements and what we call this quantum of leave for our permanent employees. So here we're talking specifically about our full-time and part-time employees. So our shift workers, you may know, are entitled to an extra week of annual leave for every year of work. However, what's a shift worker? How does that work? What we find here, clause 31.2, it defines what a shift worker is for the purpose of a quantum of leave. That's spelled out on the screen there. It's a pretty specific definition. And interestingly, it varies from the definition of a shift worker at clause 29. Okay. The so what factor here for me, or what's really interesting, is you can be a shift worker for the definition of payroll, accruing those afternoon night shift penalties, and never actually accrue an extra week of annual leave because you're not meeting that definition for the purpose of quantum of leave. So as an example, if I work Monday to Thursday every 6 p.m. to 11 p.m., I'm a shift worker. I'm working shift work. I'm regularly working that afternoon shift, but I'm never actually working on the weekend to meet that definition. So I'm flagging this with you to go, what are we doing in our systems to make sure that we're not overpaying leave or over accruing it for everyone that's set up as a shift worker, as a work tag in the system? There needs to be some kind of annual reconciliation process where we're looking at that. Speaking with our systems and audit lead, Renee, it is a manual process, but we can make it quite a simple one for you as well. So making sure we're flagging that and we're not accidentally overpaying or underpaying that leave entitlement is going to be very important there. Oh, Emma, I've just seen the time. I've gotten way too excited nerding out on these topics. So I'm going to try and keep it top level so we can get to our Q&A. Rostered days off and sleepovers. The reason why I have this on the screen for you now and the key point I want to share is this idea in clause 25.3 that tells us our permanent employees need to be free from duty for 2 full days. Okay. We have personally contacted the Fair Work Ombudsman about this to go, how do you define 2 full days? Because me, a normal person, would go, I've come off a sleepover shift on a Tuesday morning. I'm off from Tuesday morning to Wednesday morning to Thursday morning. I've had 48 hours off. I can come back to work again on the Thursday morning. Sounds reasonable, doesn't it? No. The definition here of 2 full days is talking about it being all of Tuesday off, all of Wednesday off. Okay. So in this example, if I'm coming off a sleepover at say 6 a.m. or 8 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, if I'm going to have 2 full days off, ideally consecutive, I can't actually go back to work again until Friday, right? Because I've got all of Wednesday, all of Thursday off. Okay. So from a rostering perspective, making sure we're compliant with our RDOs, we want to look into this. I've had businesses trip up by offering the best work-life balance of only working Monday, Wednesday, Friday nights for their permanent employees that resulted in breaching this clause of the award. And again, something we might look at putting an IFA in place for. Okay. So there are ways around it for it to work for everyone. But if we're not doing that correctly, by default, we are breaching our award obligations. Client cancellations and shift changes. I think the key point I want to get out here with the minimum amount of time I have left for Emma is around when it even is not covered by an award. Okay, again, NDIS pricing guidelines of when a client cancels, when you can charge is very different to what the award says about that particular scenario. So the award is talking about defining client cancellation provisions as when that disability service is cancelled or rescheduled by the customer and it's for a full-time or part-time employee. So no entitlement for casuals here around client cancellation. This is a big one in this industry, okay? It's happening within 7 days according to the award. So again, different to the pricing guidelines. We have options. We have options to direct the employee to do other work during that time. We have options to cancel the shift and potentially look at make-up time. The make-up time section of this clause is very prescriptive in terms of how it goes about, and it can be a bit of an administrative nightmare. I think the key point I want to get across here is to have a client cancellation rostering policy, because the amount of times employee expectations do not align with what the award says, does not align with what the pricing guidelines say, and it just creates this sense of entitlement that is not rooted in a sustainable business model. Really important to set those expectations in a rostering policy to get a little bit of balance back there. So make sure we've got a rostering policy on our to-do list. Very quickly, 24-hour care shifts in terms of when these apply, almost never. I hear people regularly rostered for 24-hour shifts, very different to the specific award clause provision. What I will say to you here and your key takeout, if you are rostering someone for a shift that is 24 hours or you intend on using this 24-hour care shift, call us or go back to the award and specifically read when it can apply. we can only actually work up to 8 hours in that 24-hour period. We have a 55% loading on top of the rate that will apply as well. And we do have overtime for if we're providing more than 8 hours worth of supports during that period of time. We also still need our break between shifts, so we cannot do consecutive 24-hour shifts. Last one, I promise, Emma, excursions. Now, I did touch on this earlier. We see this come up quite a lot. But the key points that I want to get across here and what we see in the award, our ordinary hours of work, in accordance with the award, is 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. Monday to Sunday. Great. Excursions clause, not so much. Switches it on its head. We're going from 6 till 8 to 8 till 6 and Monday to Friday. Okay. What happens outside of that? We have overtime. So even if we're a shift worker, if we're working after 6 p.m. on an excursion, it's going to be overtime rates. Interestingly, we need to pay the sleepover allowance, but only on a Monday to Friday. So if the excursion spans a weekend, we don't actually have that allowance. As you can see, there's some pretty weird and wonderful things that are happening here. And we want to also be clear around those expectations of when someone is free from duty or when they're on call, similar to a sleepover component there. What I will say with excursions that I mentioned before, having some kind of travel or excursion agreement in place to clearly define those parameters is important. I've seen situations where a family might be traveling and we are staying in a 3-bedroom apartment, families in 2 bedrooms, the support workers in the 3rd bedroom, and we're clocking off at 6 o'clock. However, the clients that we're all there to support might be having some kind of escalated or complex behaviour after 6 o'clock. At that point, they're off the clock. They're not coming back on. And naturally, they're probably going to want to help and provide supports. But when are they clocking back on? When are they just doing that as a concerned community member? Okay, we want to be clear on those expectations to make sure we're mitigating the costs associated in those particular scenarios, because it can come back to bite us. Oh, okay, Emma, I'm so sorry. I'm going to get you to wrap all this up for me so we can jump straight back into this Q&A and get some questions answered.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Corinne. That was so informative. And we've already had some preliminary questions come through for the Q&A, so keep them coming. So bringing this all back to the so what factor, why does this matter? SCHADS compliance means taking active steps to build a strong, well-run business before issues arise. Instead of waiting for problems, successful organizations will anticipate and prevent them. So ask yourself these questions. Are staff correctly classified and on the right pay point? When was the last time classifications were reviewed? Do you have frameworks in place, such as pay point progression checklists? Misclassification is a common and costly risk that we do regularly encounter in organizations. We covered this in a lot of detail in our part 1 webinar. So if you did miss it, we would recommend to watch that section in particular. Contracts, do employment contracts clearly cover key award terms like 10-hour shifts and 8-hour breaks after sleepovers, which are subject to agreement with the employees? Are your policies tailored, current? Are they reviewed every 6 months? Policies are not only setting out expectations, but they also protect your organization from compliance risk, and they provide consistency in managing your workforce. And lastly, when did you last audit rosters, leave, and payroll? Regular reviews help catch issues early, and they avoid the risk associated with a set and forget mentality. Too often, we see underpayment cases escalate to the Fair Work Commission, situations that could have ultimately been prevented through timely audits. So really important to do this proactively. If any of these questions raise concerns, it's important to take proactive approach to compliance. Addressing issues early not only reduces risk, but also strengthens your business's foundation for sustainable growth and success. Now, before we wrap up, I'd just like to take a quick moment to share how Effective HR can continue supporting your organization beyond today's session. For those of you who are new to us or just need a quick refresher, Effective HR, we're a specialist HR and IR consulting supporting businesses across Australia. We have expertise in HR, safety, payroll compliance, and a strong focus on the SCHADS Award. It is our bread and butter. We live and breathe it. We work very closely with employers in the social and community services sector to simplify compliance and provide practical ongoing support. And we do this through two different ways. Firstly, we have what we call our HR on demand service, which gives you direct access to a dedicated consultant so that you can get the advice you need when you need it. The service is a pay per hour basis, so it's very flexible and there's none of that lock-in contract or long-term commitments. Our other service that we do offer is HR Partner, which is more of a proactive, structured year-round solution, which includes unlimited access to advice, including that critical SCHADS Award advice, fair work legal representation, contracts, policies, and all of the proactive updates that come alongside. And very much it's designed to help you stay ahead of compliance and not become reactive to it. Our packages also include options to integrate systems, which are absolutely fundamental. We utilize Exemplo as our HR system and for payroll KeyPay. These integrations are really valuable for any business that is covered by the SCHADS Award, particularly KeyPay, because you have those fantastic SCHADS Award rule sets built in, which automates complex pay calculations such as penalties, allowances, and overtime. Now, we're happy to open the floor for questions. Alternatively, if you would prefer a one-on-one advice session, you can book in a complimentary session via our website. Just click on the QR code in the corner and submit your details on the website. So, Corinne, are you ready for some Q&A?
Oh, I was born ready, Emma. Let's go.
So the first question that we had come through was regarding remote work and specifically for full-time employees. So the scenario is if we have a full-time employee that's doing, let's say Monday to Friday, 8 to 4:30, they're doing a 38-hour weekly, weekly hours. But let's say that they then do an additional 2 hours remote work. So that brings them to 40. Is that 2 hours? What do we classify that as? Is that going to be classified as overtime or would that be dealt with as ordinary time?
That's such a good question. And I love the remote work clause that's spelled out at clause 25.10. It's also very prescriptive as to what is remote work and how we pay it. What we see specifically there, and I'm just pulling up the award specifically, that is rates of pay for remote work, subsection D, and it's telling us that when the work is performed in excess of 38 hours or 76 hours per fortnight, then overtime rates will apply. So it would really depend on the structure of the roster, but essentially if someone's working over 38 hours a week or 76 hours a fortnight, it's going to be at overtime rate. So we want to be making sure we're hopefully setting up an after hours service perhaps that allows us to do that in a more sustainable way than paying overtime, or potentially incorporating those 2 hours into the salary and making sure that's high enough to compensate.
Amazing. Thank you, Corinne. And another question that we had come through regarding full-time engagements, but on first aid allowances. So is the first aid allowance paid to full-time employees when they're on leave? So if they go on annual leave, if they're calling in sick and they go on personal carers leave, are they still going to be receiving their first aid allowance?
Oh my gosh, we had this client question come through this week actually. So firstly, with first aid allowance, specifically it is capped, like it's only up to the standard rate and it's only payable on those ordinary hours worked. Okay. So under the award, if someone's working 48 hours, 40 hours, you're not getting the first aid allowance on hours 39 and 40. Okay. Secondly, to work out whether or not we are paying the allowance during periods of leave, and let me say this advice is specific to the first aid allowance under this Award, because different awards, different allowances are also very specific. But what we do here, because it's not prescriptive, is we default back to our next piece of legislation being our Fair Work Act and the Fair Work regs that support that provide definitions of essentially how annual leave is paid and looking at how that interacts. So I feel comfortable saying that we're not paying it on periods of leave, and we want to be clear in setting that expectation with our employees. And again, for this particular scenario only, based on what our Fair Work Act is saying as well.
Amazing, amazing. Now, going over to day workers versus shift workers. So if we have an employee that normally works a day shift, but they're asked on the very odd ad hoc occasion to work 4 p.m. to 9 p.m., so going outside of our span, in this instance, are they required to be paid an afternoon shift loading, or are they paid for overtime for any hours that are worked after 8 p.m.?
Really good question. The quick answer is overtime after 8 p.m. So if you're a day worker and then just every now and again that's coming up, it'll be overtime for the hours outside of that. If you're gradually evolving your roster, that means it might be better to classify you as a shift worker, and that's been notified of that change. You would then be paying the shift rate penalties for the entirety of the shift, not just after 8 p.m. portion, if that makes sense.
Perfect, thank you. And around client cancellation, so we just wanted, we had a clarification question. So for our casual employees, if the shift is cancelled just before a shift is due to commence, do we still need to pay the casual support worker?
Yeah, really good question. This is not covered in the legislation, all right? There's nothing around what an entitlement is here. So we then need to look at what is reasonable, okay? So in absence of that legislative entitlement, that's what we're then looking at what our case law expectations are saying. This is where policy is going to be our best friend to set what you say is reasonable. My advice is to say, if I've started getting ready and traveling to that shift, I think it's fair and reasonable to pay that shift. Okay, so if my shift is starting at 9 o'clock and I've got my uniform on and I've got my keys and I'm walking out the door at 8:15, I think it's fair to pay that, right? However, if my shift is being cancelled at 7 p.m. the night before and I'm getting a quick SMS to tell me, well, no, I'm not being paid for that. This is where setting those expectations in a policy, you've got flexibility to do that, to make it very clear. And even in the situation where, okay, I can bill it, so I may pay them for the minimum engagement, so paying them for, say, 2 hours of that shift instead of the originally scheduled 8, what are we going to do to make sure that that time is time well spent? Do we have any tasks that they can help out doing, any special projects or other services? Could they do buddy shadowing? So we've got peer-to-peer reviews and support. Could they do online training modules to upskill? Like, how can we be making that time useful and redirecting and making sure that that's clear in a policy, as opposed to paying someone to sit on their bum, because I just cannot deal with that.
Amazing, amazing. Well, we'll wrap up the Q&As there. Thank you again for joining us today. We hope this advanced session gave you the clarity and the tools to feel more confident in managing SCHADS compliance. We do have part 3 coming up on the 26th of August at 12 p.m. Part 3 will be covering managing engagement and rostering for workforce efficiency. So please register and we will see you back in August on the 26th. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, guys.